On August 13, 2013, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and a collection of state attorneys general filed a lawsuit to block the merger between U.S. Airways and American Airlines. The Justice Department alleged that the merger would reduce the number of major domestic airlines. It would prevent American Airlines from implementing plans to expand service, and it would also eliminate U.S. Airways' low-cost Advantage Fares program. Now, 3 months later, and just 2 weeks before the trial, the government and the parties reached a settlement under which U.S. Airways and American Airlines would have to divest slots at 2 airports and gates at 5 airports in order to merge. In its settlement filings, the Justice Department explicitly acknowledged that this remedy would not create a new independent competitor, it would not replicate American Airlines' expansion plans, and it would not preserve U.S. Airways' low-cost Advantage Fares program. Some of the experts we interviewed were very critical of the Justice Department's decision to settle a merger case on terms that even the agency itself acknowledged would not alleviate the specific allegations of competitive harm in the complaint.
It was really startling how many of the allegations in the government's complaint against this airline merger were not addressed by the settlement. So is that appropriate? I think it's a really a questionable practice, because you have to realize here the government is not just a private litigant. The government is asserting there's an injury to competition. It's enforcing the antitrust laws for the benefit of consumers throughout the country. In my view, a complaint should not just be a negotiating tactic, but really a statement of what is the harm arising from the merger. Of course, in the context of litigation, one cannot, if one settles a case, one generally doesn't get everything that one seeks. No question about that. But the government has a special responsibility to make sure the harms that are identified in an antitrust complaint are satisfied. And so, it's probably a question of degree. If they get about 75% of what the concerns were, one would think that's okay. In this case, I think they got about 20%. And that, I think, really raises troubling questions. Is the antitrust agency, is antitrust litigation just sort of a tactic to go down the road, or does the government have greater responsibilities and both in issuing its complaint and also seeing that the allegations of the complaint are taken care of? I take the latter view, and I don't think that a complaint should just be a litigating tactic. But maybe we see that this administration, this Justice Department, takes the former view. I mean, that's the lesson. It's one case, but perhaps that's a lesson we can draw out of this case.
We've learned that despite long-held best practices, the DOJ will settle a case for less than half a loaf, even after exhaustive pre-litigation settlement negotiations have failed, and after a detailed complaint has been filed and aggressively litigated at great expense. It's generally been considered best for the government not to negotiate at this point, because it undermines the incentive to settle before all the issues are actually on the table. And one would have at least expected a settlement in this case that dealt with all of the principal allegations. The daylight between the complaint and the remedy is extraordinary in this case, raising the question of whether the public interest has in fact been served.
Now, of course, the antitrust lawyers who represented the 2 carriers in the merger offered a different view of the circumstances behind the agency's settlement.
I think it's pretty much an indication of, I would say, what we've always known. If the department files a case and then settles it, you're going to see that settlement will be oftentimes somewhat different from all the relief they asked for in the complaint. But that's the nature of settlements. They're usually compromises. It's perhaps been a little more exposed recently because the government has brought cases and then settled them, whereas the normal practice has been to settle the case, then file a complaint that's to some extent tailored to the settlement. And so it looks like the settlement and the complaint match. But, in the old days, before there was a Hart-Scott-Rodino, that was fairly typical, and that's the nature inherently of a settlement, not only with the government, but with private parties, obviously. And the Tunney Act is what is designed to serve as the check on the process to make sure that the settlement is not politically corrupt. And I think that's certainly the case with those settlements. So I'm not sure that we've learned anything new. I think that for maybe some of the people who are a little younger and don't remember the old days, it's a little bit of back to the future.
I don't really think the airlines merger tells us much about settlement policy as such. Every case is unique, and this case had the relatively unusual aspect of being a case that was settled after a complaint was filed. Most cases are settled at the same time a complaint is filed. This settlement was within the bounds of something that the parties were willing to agree to, which is always the standard for a settlement. I don't really think it tells us much of anything other than neither party, put it another way, both parties thought the settlement was preferable to going to trial, which is how settlements get done.
We also interviewed antitrust lawyers who followed the settlement and lawsuit with an eye towards how they would counsel their own clients who might be thinking about merging in the near future. Here's what they had to say.
In the American Airlines case, there's been a lot of discussion about whether there was political pressure and why is it that the government's settlement looked so different from the complaint. There's a few things to say about that. First, the agencies are clearly not immune from political pressure. They read the papers. However, and more importantly, they really are professionals, and the way I think about it is that what they ultimately are trying to do is they're trying to do their best in light of the circumstances to protect consumers. So what you see is that at times they make the decision that the best deal that they can get is a deal that isn't the ideal deal that they wished they could have gotten. And I think you really see that in the American Airlines US Air case, without knowing exactly what was going through their minds. It appears that there was a calculation that in order to get some protection for consumers from whatever concerns they saw in this merger, they were prepared to sign up a deal that gave them less than perhaps they had initially thought would be the ideal solution in that merger.
The airlines merger settlement was an interesting case in the antitrust world. It raises a lot of questions about what the government's role should be when it litigates against parties.